Who wouldn't have liked to buy their parents' house at the price their parents paid years ago? Well, today we're going to look at the past as I have a chat with Pete Wargent to see what clues it can give us about the future of property.
Are you interested in property investing, success or money? Well, you're in the right place. This is the Michael Yardney podcast, where each week you'll learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in 20 minutes or less. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, who has once again been voted Australia's leading property investment advisor. That's the fourth time he's won a similar award in the last 6 years.
Who wouldn't like to buy their parents' house at the price their parents paid way back then? Of course, that's the benefit of hindsight, isn't it? But that's something we're going to explore in this week's show as I chat with Pete Wargent. Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, particularly to all the new listeners, and thanks for all the returning listeners, because today we're going to look back in the past for lessons for the future and how they could relate to our property markets. Now, I recently had a chat with Pete Wargent and really enjoyed it because he's always full of great insights. So whether you're a beginning investor or already a very established investor, I'm sure there's going to be some useful things in my light-hearted chat with Pete. So let's click the play button and have a listen to our talk. Earlier this year, there was news that a new Crocodile Dundee movie was going to be made. Now, way back in 1986, Paul Hogan starred in the original movie inspired by the true-life exploits of Rod Ansell, and that movie became a worldwide box office hit and put Australia on the world map as a holiday destination. I recently read a great blog from my good friend Pete Wargent, who looked back at what would have happened if Mick Dundee had to assess the changes happening in Australia since 1986. Maybe he'd gone, I don't know, on walkabout stateside for a few decades. So welcome, Pete. Thanks for joining me today.
Pleasure, Michael.
Now, for those of you who don't know Pete, he's a best-selling author. He's one of the sharpest financial and economic commentators that I know, and I love reading his daily commentary at Pete Wargent Blogspot. So, Pete, can I tell you a little bit about the Crocodile Dundee film?
Sure, sounds good.
In the early 1980s, I invested in a number of movies. Stupid decision. I did it for tax reasons, and that's the wrong reason to invest, of course. And I was invited to invest in the first Crocodile Dundee movie by the same promoters who I'd invested in other movies. And one of my poor, and I've made lots of poor investment decisions, was to say, hey, that's not going to work. There's no international audience. And there wasn't a completion guarantee on that movie. They couldn't even get people to put the money up. So I chose not to invest. Pete, I'd still be getting royalties today if I'd made that decision. So I made a wrong decision. But I guess we've all made silly investment decisions, or not.
Yeah, I think actually I've read elsewhere that a number of people, including I think Michael Hutchins, actually invested mainly for the tax benefits, as you said, to try and write off a few tax losses, and then unexpectedly the most successful Australian export. And as you said, even all these years later, still talking about it.
That's right. And I watched it again recently on Netflix and really enjoyed it. So let's imagine Mick Dundee, that star with the big knife and the great sense of humour, came back to Australia. It's now 32 years later. A lot has changed. Australia's grown up. What have been the big changes in Australia in that time?
Yeah, I think if you remember back to the original movie, so one of the main premises of the film was that, of course, Mick was up in the Territory, very small population out in the outback, and he went over to Manhattan, and famously his line was, imagine 7 million people living in one place, must be the friendliest place on earth. If Mick Dundee was to come back to Sydney today, for example, the population of Sydney is now over 5 million, and not quite a Manhattan feel, but that's certainly the direction that Australia's cities have been heading. So the population has increased by more than a third since back then. So we're close to 25 million today from 16 million back in the mid-80s. And Sydney's population has gone from 3.5 to 5 million. So, I mean, I didn't even move to Sydney until the 1990s, but I can remember it's very much a city where I used to live down in the Shire. We used to drive everywhere. It was very easy. But the city is now much more congested. Interestingly, though, the population of the territory is still very small, so under 250,000. But in the big capital cities, there's a movement towards location and trading space for place because of the increased number of people and the increasing traffic.
I think it's a good lesson because we can learn from what's happening in the big cities overseas and what's going to make a good investment, what sort of properties are going to be in strong demand, are going to be affected by how we want to live and where we want to live. And you're right, we're trading space, I should say, for big backyards for place being in the right location, and I guess trading backyards for balconies and courtyards, particularly Sydney and Melbourne, which really have Manhattanized. But you look at all the big capital cities of Australia, and that's happening a lot. What other big changes have there been, Pete?
Well, if you remember in the early parts of the movie, Sue Charlton, the journalist from the States, came over to visit Australia. One of the
she became his wife in the end, didn't she?
That's right, Linda Kozlowski. So it's a very amusing part of the film. Of course, the joke being that Sue wouldn't be able to look after herself in the outback, Sheila like you, as Paul Hogan said in the movie. I think, obviously attitudes have changed a lot over the years, but the workforce, just in general, Sue Charlton, the character, was a pioneer, I suppose, of the high-powered female in the workforce. But today, in fact, in last year, Australia's female participation rate rose to the highest ever level. So I think one key change, particularly for housing, actually, is that while when we were growing up, it was quite usual for dad to be in the office and mum to be home with the kids, certainly was in our household. Today, it would be very common to see two incomes, particularly in the aspirational suburbs, and people just do what it takes to get into those housing markets. So that's been a really big change. It's having some other effects as well, because the employment rate is now so high that it's actually has been putting some downward pressure on wages because there are just more people available in the workforce. But I do think wages growth will return over the next year or two, and that's definitely been one of the key changes, though. The workforce has really changed from being a male-dominated environment to being a much more balanced one.
Well, one of the things that borrowers today are concerned about is that the banks are not looking at them kindly and putting restrictive lending practices in. Way back when that movie was done, Pete, they wouldn't even accept a wife's wages even if she was working. And now, of course, the banks accept that both income earners equal, even though, as we know from what's going on in the media, maybe wages aren't always the same. With regard to that, what other demographic changes have there been over the last 30 years?
Yeah, I think, actually, even just touching on what you said there, I remember back in the 1980s, mortgages and debt was generally something, if not to be feared, it was certainly getting out of debt as quickly as possible was definitely the mindset, because I can remember my parents sitting around the dinner table and talking about the huge leap in interest rates when the Bank of England had a panic, and certainly the view back then was that debt was something being minimised, whereas today I think with lower interest rates it's seen more as a tool, I suppose, for people to get ahead.
Well, one of the things that maybe not obvious to investors today is that in those days, if interest rates were below 10%, you were happy. Interest rates are considerably lower. But, Pete, that's related also to the cost of funds, cost of money, because inflation is much lower today too. So you've got to take into account the general economic circumstances, what's happening to the economy, inflation, the cost of goods when you understand what interest rates are and whether you should take on debt. And good debt has never been an issue, not way back then either.
Yeah, that's true. And I think it wasn't until the early 1990s that Australia actually adopted inflation targeting. And since that time, as you said, we've had much lower inflation and interest rates have just come back under control. And in fact, at the moment, as low as we've ever seen. So, and I think in terms of other just demographic changes related to that male-female divide that we used to have back then. We are seeing the crude marriage rate has actually declined since the 1980s. I mean, on average, a lot of people are still getting married, but they're doing it later than they used to. But it's just become a much more disjointed picture. I think the ABS stats show we're much more likely to marry somebody who was born overseas or has foreign-born parents. There are more divorces than there used to be. Certainly, it's a more disjointed picture, and you'll probably see more lone person households and more mixed households. So the picture of the traditional family unit is not quite as clear cut as it used to be.
Clearly, things have changed, and that has to do. That affects property also because of household formation. So it's not necessarily population growth that drives demand; it's how many households there are. And since there are more of us in one or two people households, since there are more people getting married later, single people living longer, we need more households, more dwellings for the same number of people, and that's one of the drivers of our property markets, isn't it, Pete?
It is actually one of the interesting things I noticed in the census, and this is just something to be wary of, I guess, for property investors, is that in some of the inner city suburbs, you actually saw median incomes decline a bit over the last 5 years. And when you just think through the process of what's happened there, I think we're seeing, with the high cost of renting, we're seeing more younger people actually sharing households. And nothing wrong with that, but it's just, I think, something to be wary of for landlords, is investing in some of these lower quality properties where you can end up with 4 or 5 people renting a property together. Now, I can remember from my student days that doesn't always work out brilliantly, but particularly if you get a block of units where there are lots of multi-tenanted units, that can just drag down the overall feel of a premises. So it's just one of the interesting trends I noticed from the census. So suburbs like Pyrmont, for example, you'd normally expect to see incomes rising strongly in those kind of aspirational areas, but I think we're probably seeing more people coupling up with friends to try and rent properties together that are close to the city. So it's just an interesting trend I picked up.
That is interesting. We've always targeted areas where the demographic is such that they've got higher disposable incomes rather than the lower ones, as you suggested. Now, over the years, television has changed and the way we entertain ourselves and consume video has changed, hasn't it?
It is. So when Mick Dundee went to Manhattan, he took a sort of a derisory look at the television and sort of said, "Oh yeah, well I've seen one of those before." And in recent years, I suppose he would be pleased to hear that free-to-air television has been declining. But that said, people are still managing to watch 3 hours per day of free-to-air television. But today we've got an average of 6 screens per household, and overwhelmingly households still do have a TV screen, 99%. But what we now have is multitasking TV screens. So we've got Netflix and all of these other connectivity. So that's the key things that's changed. We're much more connected than we used to be. We're still getting through 30 hours of screen time a week on average. But much more internet use. And one of the interesting things that's come out of that is that, contrary to what a lot of people might have expected, we're not living further apart as a result of the connectivity. We're actually living closer together.
People said, we don't have to be near people. We can actually go afar. But we are social beings, aren't we? I think the other interesting point you made, Pete, is that many houses have more television screens than they have people, and then they worry why the money doesn't last the month out and why their budgets don't meet. Now, the cities that we live in have changed. You mentioned that they've become a lot bigger. I remember when Mick Dundee went to New York, he was accosted by some people. There was that lovely line that, "That's not a knife, this is a knife." What's happened to our big cities in Australia, Pete?
Well, Australia, we never had a particularly sort of dangerous cities anyway. The homicide rate was already pretty low back in the mid-'80s at about 2 per 100,000. But today the cities have got safer over time. So, in particular, we used to think of inner city areas as being a bit dodgy, but Australia's homicide rate now is under 1 per 100,000, so as close to nil as we're ever going to see. And crime rates are relatively low and falling. I did some work with a research group recently, which it did some quite in-depth research into crime rates and house prices and capital growth. And I know we sometimes talk about, you want to invest in areas with low crime rates and so on. But interestingly, what they found was that not only is there no correlation, it might even be a reverse correlation because of gentrification. So if you find areas like, for example, Sydney's inner west, where crime rates were previously higher, and I think if you look at other movies from earlier times, so the Hugh Jackman film in Erskineville, where the inner west was really an area where people just didn't want to live that much.
Sure.
And as they've gentrified, those suburbs have often outperformed.
Sure. And there's the inner northern suburbs in Melbourne where the Underbelly series was filmed years ago as well, and they're very much gentrified as the industry, because in those days there was still a lot of industry in those inner suburbs, and with the freeways, the industry moved out and young people moved in, and gentrification is still occurring, and maybe a little bit more now in the middle ring suburbs. So location is everything, especially as our cities become more congested, Pete. I've heard you say that once they get to about 5 million people, they become more unlivable.
Yeah, that's something which is born out of international experience. When cities get to about that 5 million level, and to be fair, it does depend on where you draw the boundary of a city. So Sydney might or might not incorporate the Central Coast, depending on who's doing the boundaries. But just look at what we've seen in the media over the last 12 months. Sardine Sydney, overcrowding, trains overcrowded, primary schools overcrowded. There's just something about that 5 million level. Shows that cities reach a critical mass where livability just becomes more of a challenge. And public transport in particular, we saw this in London years ago, where it went from being very common for people to drive everywhere, and then we went through a phase where some people didn't bother with a car, and then ultimately young professionals didn't bother with a car at all. So Sydney's still further back in that journey, but just follow the Sydney Morning Herald over the last year, and you can see how that's becoming an issue. In Melbourne, I've done some research into the demographic pyramid, and one of the things I've found is that there's a real time bomb coming from Melbourne's primary schools, because we've just had such a huge surge in the number of babies that are coming up to primary school age, and yet the construction of primary schools just isn't keeping pace. So if you're looking at areas that are going to outperform in terms of house prices, well, just find those good primary schools, because the competition for housing is going to be almost limitless.
And I guess the bottom line of that is that location is everything. Location close to amenities, but particularly public transport, whether it's trams in Melbourne, trains and buses in other cities as well. I think the other big change in Australia since Crocodile Dundee's early days, Pete, is that we've become a wealthy country. We've become a very wealthy nation.
Yeah, that's right. So I think, Australia, we had a mining boom. We've had 26 years without a recession. One of the things I've noticed is that we're now the second wealthiest country in the world on a per capita basis in terms of household wealth. But it can come with increased anxiety for a lot of people. I think a lot of studies have shown that if everyone's struggling, it doesn't feel so bad. But when your next door neighbour is getting ahead, particularly in Australia through property prices and the share market to a lesser extent, then that can actually create a lot of just a feeling of disquiet with people, because it's difficult to see other people doing better than you. So, record household wealth approaching 10 trillion now. And yes, no sign of a recession on the horizon. So, it's been a spectacular story and a spectacular run for Australia.
Sure. And while the country in general has initially, 2 centuries ago, lived off the sheep's back, it was then minerals. But the average wealth for the average Australian is really in their home and in real estate. And now it's very much service industries as well that we export, whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's finance. So we're moving to a different financial era, and that's where jobs growth is occurring, Pete, and that's where wages growth is occurring, and they're the people who are going to be able to afford better properties, Pete.
Yeah, that really is. I think if you look at it historically, mining directly has never been that big an employer anyway. But of course, mining brings in wealth and it brings in service industry support and so on. But certainly over the last 12 months, the economy surprised a lot of people. An extra 400,000 plus jobs in 2017. Business surveys yesterday showing business confidence and conditions at seriously high levels now. So, what's happening? Well, I guess what happened was we had the end of the mining construction boom around 2012. And we just had a long period where as that fell away, there was a drag on the economy. But that drag's now finished. So, there's some better times ahead for the economy, and that's great. So jobs growth, unemployment falling, and eventually wages growth returning. So lots of positives there.
Well, part of that also has been a very strong population growth, as you were suggesting, and a large part of that, more than half of that's coming from immigration. We know a lot of that's happening now from different locations, particularly China and India. What's happening to the age group of people coming to Australia? My sense is that we're getting younger migrants, but what's happening to the average age in Australia?
Yeah, so the median age, the census is the best source of data, and the median age has just been creeping higher in Australia over time. So we're now a median age of 37. It's partly because people are living much longer than they used to. That's a big factor. Because as you said, the immigrants coming into Australia, including myself, tend to be aged under 30 because that's the way the visa processes have been skewed historically. And in recent years, I'm sure you've noticed too, there's been a big surge in international students. So those people will then go on, in many cases, to permanent residency visas or other types of sundry visa classes. So immigration is generally brings down the age, at least initially, of the country. Of course, obviously, immigrants themselves, including me, do unfortunately get older over time. But then we have children too. So it's a mixed picture. But generally, we're seeing the median age is just creeping higher as people live longer.
Now, if Mick Dundee came back from overseas, or even if he came from Darwin to our other big capital cities, he'd notice as he walked down the main streets of the city, how we look, who we are, is very different. More of us have been born overseas. We're much more cosmopolitan. The flavour of our cities, the nature of our cities has changed, hasn't it, Pete?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it would be fair to say that before the 1980s, many people, certainly in Europe, saw Australia as being a bit disconnected, is a long way away, a bit backward in some ways.
We were. We didn't like to admit it, but we were.
Yeah, but that's really has changed now. And if you look at Sydney and Melbourne in particular, the ABS showed last year that the number of overseas-born Australians is at the highest level in 120 years, so essentially since the gold rush. And if you include people with foreign-born parents as well, close to half of the country. So, Sydney and Melbourne, and particularly in Sydney, very high overseas-born population. And it's just that's brought with it a different outlook, a cosmopolitan outlook. It's a more outward-facing country, and it's a place that people actually want to come and move to. Particularly, I've got a number of Chinese clients, and it's just interesting to learn from them about what it is about Australia's cities that people in China and elsewhere in Asia really like. And it's a place that people can come to. It's modern, good lifestyle, but also it's a place where you're not. There's no prejudice. Anyone can get ahead. It's okay to buy a nice house and a car in the suburbs, and
yes.
unlike in some parts of Europe where there's old money and a more rigid class structure, Australia just doesn't have that in the same way, and that's become, as you mentioned, I remember all those years ago, Australia will become a playground of the rich for Asia, and that's what's happening.
Definitely. So we are very lucky. Some of us who are listening to this were just born in the right place. Others, our parents chose to bring us here, like me, and you were brave enough to come across as an immigrant as well. People aspire to live here, and I think that's one of the things that's going to underpin Australia's property market, because in general it's related to population growth or household formation and the wealth of the nation. And there's no suggestion that in the immediate future we're going to slow down our population growth. Both sides of Parliament really now are looking at a big Australia. And really there's no sign that we're going to not remain a wealthy country, even though we'll have ups and downs. So the future's looking good. Pete, a question without notice. Pull out your crystal ball. What are we going to look like 30 years from now if Mick Dundee survived another 30 years and came back? What would be the big changes?
Wow, that's a big question when you think how much has changed in the last decade. I suppose there are...
Can we really?
No, I mean, I think this is one of the things that, and I've been to a number of lectures on the subject and I've read all the reports. I think what's actually really hard to visualise is as the big cities, particularly Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, grow, a lot of those areas which traditionally have been low-rise areas with sort of old fibro houses or industrial areas, there'll just be apartments everywhere. It's very hard to imagine. We tend to have a view in Australia that we have dense cities, but actually we don't. If you actually look at it in international terms, we have a few dense suburbs. So we have Potts Point, we have Pyrmont and a few others, South Bank in Melbourne. But actually you don't have to go very far from the city centres to have essentially very spread out suburbs. So that's going to change. I think the long-term vision for cities like Sydney is that we'll have essentially we'll have a Western Sydney with its own airport. We'll have a Parramatta, which will be the second CBD, and then we'll have the main city as we know it today with North Sydney. So they'll be a bit more disjointed, the cities. So they'll have their own employment hubs rather than being monocentric. But the big change is they're just going to be much, much bigger. As you said, there are always teething problems with population growth. There's a lot of campaigning for a slower rate of immigration. But generally, I mean, as you said, governments don't like to slow down immigration unless they have to. But you tend to find that it just follows the economy. So when through the mining boom, population was extremely strong, and then it slowed down again as the economy slowed, and now it's picking up again as the economy picks up. And ultimately, people will will come to Australia when the jobs are there. So, and at the moment, unemployment is expected to fall back towards 5% over the next few years, and people will keep coming.
Well, thank you very much for sharing those insights. And what it has made me once again realise, and I realise it every time we're lucky enough to go overseas and travel too, is we're living in the best country in the world and at the best time ever to be living. So I think one of the real important messages that I like giving in my mentorship sessions every week in these podcasts also is to be grateful. We should appreciate what we've got because we are a very rich, wealthy nation. Pete, thank you very much. I know people want to follow a lot of your writings. They're regularly on Property Update, but how else can people keep up with what you write about?
Well, actually, I have a daily blog. I didn't write one yesterday because I was having a filling done. So if I've been slurring my words a bit today, that'll be why. But petewargent.blogspot.com. There's my daily updates. And property updates, of course. I'm always a regular contributor.
Fantastic. And I'm really looking forward to spending 5 days with you later this year at Wealth Retreat. You've been one of the guest speakers for quite a few years now. And we were just talking before we started recording about how it affects and changes our lives as we personally take that Wealth Retreat time seriously to work on our own personal investment goals and our businesses as well. So we're going to spend 5 days in the beginning of June together on the Gold Coast. Thank you very much for your time, Pete.
Pleasure. And I'll just give an independent review of Wealth Retreat there. I came along, as you know, Michael, some years ago now to my first Wealth Retreat. And I'll be honest, my first, my initial feeling was there's no way anyone will get me to sit still in one room for 3 or 4 days in a row. And how many years have I been coming now? And every year I really look forward to that week, because it's a week where I can turn off all the background noise and really focus on what have I achieved over the last year and what am I going to achieve over the next year. And we were just talking before we came on air there about how I've been learning to delegate, and so have you. It's amazing the stuff you pick up when you network with other successful people. It's amazing.
I look forward to catching up with you and anyone else who's interested in finding out about Wealth Retreat. Go to wealthretreat.com.au. This year, it's going to be on the Gold Coast. Only about 60 people in the room, successful business people, entrepreneurs and investors. But please don't count yourself out. Go to wealthretreat.com.au. Register your interest. I have a chat with everyone who is interested in going to make sure that it's going to be worth your time and you're not going to waste your time. Look forward to catching up with you then, Pete. Speak soon.
Cheers.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Pete. It's always fun having a talk with him about property, finance, and what's going on in the world. And I'd like to read out one of the reviews I got, because what I'm now going to do each week is give a gift to one of the reviews that somebody leaves on iTunes. So if you leave your review there and I read it out, and I'm going to try and read them all out, I'm going to give you a gift of a book. So one I got recently was from Jason Nowland. And he says, great podcast, very informative and motivational. Episodes are well laid out and a good length. Listening to these has made me want to buy your books. Thank you. Well, Jason, you're not going to have to buy my book, because if you send me an email to michael@metropole.com.au with your details, I'm going to give you a gift of one of my books. And there's another one from Opopapoo. Thank you for that interesting name on iTunes, who said, yep, it's a ripper, and also left a 5-star review. So again, if you send me an email to michael@metropole.com.au, I'd love to give you a gift of one of my books too. And I'd like you to help me help others with the gift of learning. If you could please pass information about my podcast on to one of your friends by just forwarding the email or just letting them know about it. And you'll help me even more if you leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher. Maybe if you just go to michaelyardneypodcast.com/review, michaelyardneypodcast.com/review, and leave your review. That would mean a great deal to me, and maybe you're going to win a book too. Look forward to having a chat with you next week.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect and pass on their wealth through strategic property advice. If you got value from listening to this podcast, please leave us a review and we'll read it out on a future show. Just go to michaelyardneypodcast.com/review and it will take you over to iTunes, where you can enter a review and let us know what you think. We'd really appreciate it. If you don't already subscribe on iTunes or on your Android phone, you'll find us there as Michael Yardney Podcast. If you'd like to gain instant access to the show notes or a transcript of the show, head across to michaelyardneypodcast.com. Watch out for our show next week. You learn some new ideas about property investment, success and money in around 20 minutes.